Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Design Master Training. My name is David Robison. Today we are going to be looking at the options for one-line diagrams. So if you are attending the training live, you can ask questions in the chat box. If you're watching the recording of the training, you can call or email with your questions. Our phone number is 866-516-9497, and our email address is support@designmaster.biz. So let's go ahead and get started looking at options for one-line diagrams. So I have here in AutoCAD a one-line diagram pulled up, and there are a lot of different choices and settings you can make for one-line diagrams to have them appear a little bit different when they are first created. So that's what the options are all about. We always say we don't know what your one-line diagrams look like, but we're pretty sure they don't look like this, because you talk to 10 different engineers and you get 12 different one-line diagram standards back from them. So everybody does something a little bit different, and our software endeavors to be able to handle all of that difference as well as it can. So that's what the options are all about. In our Electrical for AutoCAD software, you can find the options under the DME customization tab, under options either for your project or for your standards. And when you click that command, there's a lot of options. We're specifically looking at the one-line diagram section today. So there's all the options listed there. You'll notice that for our AutoCAD-based software, we've got a lot of different types of distribution equipment, so there's a lot of choices here. And if we go over to our Revit-based software and look at the options command there, the options, there's a little bit fewer choices because we don't have all the other stuff happening. And then in the list of types of equipment, the list of choices is shorter because we don't have as many types of equipment defined in Revit. But otherwise, the two lists of options should be pretty similar. Hopefully they're the same, beyond just having more listed in our AutoCAD software. So I'll kind of flip back and forth between the two just so that you can see them both, and they should both be working exactly the same. The first option, we're just going to start from the top and work our way down. If you have any options in particular you're curious about, feel free to jump in and I can go out of order, but otherwise I'm going to start from the top and work my way down. The first option is the distribution equipment sort order, and this one is brand new in our new software that we just released this month. So previously, when you did your generate command, it would generate your equipment in order based upon the distance of the equipment from the one that it's connected to, which it turns out no one actually lays out their one-line diagrams that way. So it was actually a really bad default choice. And so we added three different options that you can now use. You can choose breaker size, circuit number, and equipment name. And so we'll take a look at what each of those do when we run the generate command. Go ahead and cancel that to close it. So I've got my one-line diagram here with a fair amount of equipment laid out. For that one, I'm actually going to switch over to a different project. So if we come in here and we go to options and we change it from distance, we'll start with breaker size. This will actually lay it out in order based upon the size of the breakers. Right now we've got 225 and these are all 200s, just so that it's something interesting. So we will change this from 200 to 100. So now we've actually got some different options there. And if we run the generate command again, you'll see that it put them now in breaker order, 400, 225, and then the 200 and the 100. They're kind of mixed up in terms of names, but they're in order of breaker size. All right, so we looked at the first option there for breaker size. Now if we go to circuit number, and the generate, once the things are in there, the generate command isn't going to move them around because we just don't do that. It would be rude, we feel, to start messing up with your stuff because you might have moved it on purpose. So you have to erase it and rerun the generate if you change this option, which is great for showing you how the option works. It's not actually what we would ever recommend for a standard workflow. If you're having to erase and run the generate command frequently during the course of a project, something is wrong. So please don't do that. You should really only be doing this when you're trying to get your standards set up. But when you're working on a standard project and everything, all the standards are right, you shouldn't be running the generate except to add a couple additional stuff. If you're erasing and regenerating, that's actually bad. And so you should make some adjustments to your workflow so you don't have to do that, because the software is not going to work well if you do that. So I'm going to throw in the circuit number label so that we can see that these did actually sort properly. I'm actually going to do just the circuit number, not the panel name. Put that in there, and then we will match that to the other ones. If I can remember where my match command is. Probably easier to find on my Revit one. There we go, match labels. So we did these in order of circuit number. So we have the 1, 7, so we do all the odds, and then we do all the evens. So they've been laid out in circuit order. And then the final choice for the option is equipment name. Again, we'll erase and regenerate. And now it will do alphabetically A, B, L2, L3, L4. So we're not in circuit order. We're not in size order. We're in alphabetical order at this point. And then we also have distance. So if you did like that choice, you still have it. We left the code in there. We don't anticipate anyone choosing to use that in the future. But if you did want to use it, it is there. The next option is the choice of whether to display lugs on panels with main breakers. So if we go to this panel here, it has this main breaker being drawn. It also has this little box that represents the lugs. You have the choice to turn that off. So if we go to our options, change that from yes to no. And I believe if we update the one-line diagram, yeah, it'll see that that graphic standard has changed and it'll remove that. So that's just an option of whether it has that. If there is not a main breaker, I believe we still include that. And we will check that real quick. So we'll change that from having a breaker to main lugs only. And run the update again. And yeah, so the breaker falls away, but we do put the main lugs in that instance, because that's really the connection point that you need to have notated there. So that's just for panels with main breakers only that we're looking at whether we turn that lug graphic on or off. Next option, insert feeder IDs inside feeder lines, yes or no. This is currently set to yes. I'll set it to no, and we can see the change. So with yes, you get these IDs, which are these hexagons being displayed with the IDs for the feeder schedule. So if we insert the feeder schedule, actually it's already inserted, it's just somewhere else. I'm going to move it down here so it's closer to our one line. The IDs here match up with the entries here so you can see the actual size. You can turn that off if you don't want to use the feeder IDs. So if we run the update, it will get rid of those. And so now you don't have those IDs probably on the feeder schedule. If you chose to do that, you would also turn off the ID column here because it's not being used anywhere. So now you just have your feeder schedule with your feeder sizes listed there. And then typically what people, and this is before we had feeder IDs, you could put in the list of devices that have that size feeder. You could do something like that. So it would list the devices being fed with that size feeder. Also on the one-line diagram, you can add a label for the feeder size. So you could do something like this. That label's pretty long, but you might scrunch it down to a single line, something like that. And then you could match that to the other ones. So you could label your feeder sizes that way. In general, our recommendation is to use the feeder IDs. Most people do that, but if you don't want to use the IDs, you can turn them off. I'm going to turn them back on. They'll come back on the next time we do the update. Insert vertical main breaker on horizontal panels. Change that from yes to no. That is referring to this piece here. So we've got what we call a horizontal panel with a horizontal bus bar. And then we've got this little vertical piece that represents the main breaker or the main lugs connection. So this is it with that option set to yes. If I erase that L1 and if I just redo the generate, it'll actually redraw it as horizontal again, but with this new option. It's actually using a custom block that has that set already. So if I draw it manually, L1, I'm going to do a custom panel box with bus. And I missed which one I was trying to insert there. I'm trying to do L1. I draw it horizontally. Now I draw the bus in. Rather than having that little vertical piece, it just puts the lugs and the main breaker on that horizontal part. So it's a different way of drafting it, and then it makes the connection in coming in from the side. You probably pulled out something like that. That's what you want that to actually look like. So just a graphical choice you have as to whether the connection comes in from the side or above. So that's that option. Next option is insert labels inside feeder lines. I'm going to start by inserting a label on a feeder, and so we can see how that works, and then we'll change that option to see what happens. So I'm going to take the feeder size here, and you'll notice that when I draw the feeder, when I move close to the feeder line with the label, it snaps to it, either above it or below it. And it kind of nicely lines it up for you without you having to get it in the exact location. We turn that option on. And now instead of snapping near it, it's going to snap inside of it. So I take this and I do my dragging again. I gotta get the right one, there we go. So now when I drag near it, rather than snapping above and below, it snaps directly inside. I select a point inside it, and it actually breaks the feeder line for you. That's a fairly long note, so you can't see exactly what it's doing there. Let's see if I can find there's my grip point. Take this, we'll make it into 2 lines. And so there you can see it's got the break on the left and the right side. So that's the choice you have for whether your labels show up inside the line or just above and below it. That's purely your preference as to what you like that to look like. Feeder offset multiplier. This is the distance that we will spread feeders apart by default when we're doing any of our feeder offset commands. So this is going to affect the drafting, the appearance of things as they're being laid out, both during the generate command and then also when you are just using the offset command. So if I erase this whole thing and I run the generate riser command, so I was previously generating a 1 line, it's kind of a top-down, the riser is left to right. The offset is the distance between all of these feeders. So these are all 0.3 inches apart when printed on the drawing, on the actual paper. So we'd multiply it by the dim scale to get the scale factor. So if you have a 1/10 inch text, there's just enough space in there to fit text between the feeders. Is kind of why we chose that 0.3. Though it can be a little tricky if you have your labels above and below to know which one it's referring to. So you can, or if you just want them more spread out or closer together, you can adjust this. I'll set it to 0.4. And I'm going to erase this whole section here, redo the generate command, and it'll space them out a little bit. They're a little farther apart now. In the same way, the offset command, which is the feeder offset command here, when you run that, when you select the other feeders, it'll that's the default distance. You can also set a distance, so you can have a specific distance when running that command, but the default distance that's used will be pulled from that. Then we have the riser height multiplier. This is when drawing a riser during the generate, how far apart we put the floors. It's a scale factor. You kind of need to play with it to see what looks best for your projects. If I come over here to this project, it's actually laid out so that when we run the generate riser command, it's going to lay out the different floors. And so the riser multiplier is how far apart these floors are drawn, because we take the elevations and then we kind of map it to this scaled value to lay these out. So if we adjust that, it's currently set to 0.5. If I change it to 1, they're going to be twice as far apart. So I can erase all of that and run the generate command again. And you'll see that it spread the whole thing out significantly farther. So you'll want to run the generate. This is a case where you run the generate, see if it looks right, and then adjust it, and then erase and redraw. And then once you kind of have it in right the first time, then you don't mess with it anymore. So you do kind of have to play with that to figure out what looks nice for your projects and your standards, because it depends on the other blocks that you're using, what is going to end up looking good. But that is how you can control how far apart these pieces end up being drawn. Next, we have the default panel box height and the default panel box width. So if you want to, you don't have to have the generate command lay out your panels. If you want to do your own layout order, you can do that. So I'm going to erase a couple panels so we can put them in. And we have the insert distribution equipment command. I'll take panel L3. If I choose a custom panel box with bus, I can also check this specific panel box size, and it'll draw it in at that size for me. And these are the default values that are going to be used. So it gives us the height and the width. You can also override it for a specific panel. So we do something like that. And then it'll just put in a very basic looking panel for you that all the labels are not inserted because those are part of a custom block. So if you did override those values either in the options or in the command itself, you'll get a different size panel. So we can double that size. So we have a bigger panel now. And that's what that option is controlling, or both of those options together. Then we have the default fed from option, and this is for when you are doing an automatic riser during the generate command. And yeah, so you have to set that in the options. We used to have it where you could change it during the generate command, but we took it out. So it's always here. By default, it's set to top, or the kind of our standard is top. You can change it to bottom. That controls these feeders, whether they come into the tops of the panels or in from the bottom. So if I change it to bottom and run the generate command again, you'll see that it's going to draw all those connections from the bottom now. That's the default for your panels. You can override that on a per panel basis. So I could take panel L4 and in the one-line settings, say that, okay, this one, rather than being fed from the default value, which is bottom, I'm going to have it fed from the top. That's only going to have a change if I happen to have not generated or if I erase and redo the generate. So I'll go ahead and do that. And now it connects most of these from the bottom and this one from the top. It also kind of smushed it in there, which is not where I would have expected it to put it, but that's where it ended up. Then we have the default feeder connection layout. So if you have some stuff laid out and you're putting in a single panel, how are we going to connect the feeders to the panel? Are we connecting it like you were generating a riser or like you were generating a one line? So if you do it like a riser, it kind of is going to come out the side and go to the bottom or the top. If you do a one line, it always goes from the bottom of the thing above to the top of the thing you're placing. when you actually insert the item, you also have the option to change that during the insertion command as well, because it's going to control how those feeders go in. So if I get rid of panel L4 here, which is a little bit of a mess to begin with, we can come in here, take panel L4. We can connect feeders like a riser. And if we put L4 in, say over here, it does that connection to the top. And it's going from the side of L1 there. If we insert like a one line, that would expect it more to be down below. So if I put it down here, it actually connects it from the bottom of L1 to the top of L4. And then the way risers one lines work, it actually spreads out L1 so that it has the connection. So it gets a little messy if you start trying to mix your metaphors there in terms of your generate. But we do have the option as to how the connection is made. Typically, you want to have it match the generation option you were using, but if you have reason, you can make changes. For feeders that are generated in a riser, when you have a panel with no bus, you have the choice of whether the feeders are going to come from the side or from the top and the bottom. So we've been having it set to side. So all of the feeders from this L1 you'll see are coming from the side of it and then connecting to the bottoms. We could also have it come from the top or from the bottom. I believe it defaults to matching where the feeder is coming into it. So the ones coming out will go out the same way. So if we change that from side to top and bottom, actually, no, it depends on where the connection is. If you're connecting to the bottom of a feeder, you connect out the bottom of the other feeder. If you're connecting to the top, you come out the top of the original panel. So it does the adjustment there. So again, that's just a question of how you like to draft your feeders and where you want them coming out of the other panel. And if it did something like this, you would go and make that adjustment and pull that over there, so it's not as messy looking. The main Lugs Only label, it defaults to MLO, but you can change what text we put in for main Lugs Only. I'll go ahead and type the whole thing out so that when you put in the main Lugs label with the label command, it's controlling this value here, the main trip amps. So if it has an actual main trip, we put in the size. If it's main Lugs Only, we will put in what that label is. The default to MLO, but you can change it if you want to have that calling out something different. All right, carrying on, looking at the rest of the options. Next, we are getting to our default blocks. So this is kind of three sections that are all very similar. We have the default riser blocks, and then two default one-line blocks. One if you have multiple downstream panels, and then one if there's only 0 or 1 downstream panels. And these are the blocks that are put in when you run the generate command, which block that we're choosing to use for that type of equipment. Our AutoCAD-based software has a lot of types of equipment, so you can have a default for each option there. Our Revit-based software doesn't differentiate quite as much, so it has only a couple options for the defaults. You can, before the generate, go in and change what you want to be used. So if you haven't run the generate command yet and you pull up your panel, you can go into the one-line diagram block settings. And for the initial block, you can use the default, or you could change it to something else. If you know that this panel, you want to have it go in with a different block that you've defined, you could specify that here. And so if you make the change, when you run the various generate commands, it will use those blocks. For the one line, there's the question of what it does for a single block below or for just one block. I'm going to take L4 and I'm going to connect it to L3 to show you the difference on that. So L4 is going to connect to L3 now. And I'm going to erase that whole thing and regenerate the one line. So you see that L1 is drawn with one block, and it has the connections to the multiple blocks below it. L3 is drawn the same as all these other panels that don't have anything connected because we have just one panel coming from it. So if you've got just this line of panels connected, then we draw it one way. If there's multiple panels being fed, then we draw it a different way. And so that's why we have the two different options there for the default panel blocks, one-line blocks for multiple and for 0 or 1 downstream panels. Same as the one line, we have the default equipment connection blocks. There's actually two, one for the equipment connection and one for the disconnect. I don't think, actually I do have some information. So right now it's doing an equipment connection. I'm gonna change it, it'll put in a J box, and then we'll add a disconnect. So we'll do a fuse disconnect. And so that's gonna control for this block here what comes in by default because it's using the default settings. If I erase that and run the generate, it comes in with that J box and then the actual disconnect. And those are the default values. For all of these, once the blocks are in there, you can always use the change graphics command to adjust it, either on the panel itself. You could assign this to a different panel if you wanted to, or a different block. And then for equipment, you can change the equipment block. You can also change the disconnect, and the disconnect is actually part of the feeder. So you select the feeder itself, and then if it's a equipment connection, you have the disconnect block as an option. So that's where you could go change that. So it might default to none, but you could come in and you can actually put in the disconnect block if it is not in there already. Now we have blocks that are controlling a couple other options when we do our drafting of our breakers and whatnot. So I'll just kind of describe all these, and then we'll look at which blocks that they're changing. So we've got the default circuit. So that's for the circuit breakers, what block's being used. So this is currently set to not use one. We could change that to put in a breaker block. So I'll just make that one change. And if I do an update, it actually does make that change because all of these feeders are set to use the default setting. We've changed the default setting, so it puts in a breaker there automatically. So it will put in the breaker blocks on all our feeders for us. We can change the block that's used for the main breaker. So if you have a main breaker, is that going to look like a circuit breaker or something else? I'll change it to a circuit breaker that has some dots on it. It's just a slightly different graphic. And that is going to control what this graphic looks like. So we run the update. And it swapped in that different graphic there. So that's how you control what that one looks like. I changed some lugs. So I'm going to turn my lugs back on. And we'll get to the lugs at some point here. So we have that was the main breaker. And then we also have, for panels, you can have them with a fused and a non-fused switch. So you can change which block is being used if they're fused or a non-fused disconnect. And that controls, if I actually change the panel from a main breaker to a fused switch, and then I update it, it puts in this graphic instead. And so if you want to control which specific graphic is being used, you can adjust that option. And then we have options for the lugs. So we have the standard lugs, which is the lugs at the top of the bus bar. We have the double lugs, which is the lugs at the bottom of a bus bar if it's set to double lugs, so you can make connections, a feed-through connection. And then we have the double lug, sorry, is for the top lugs. So you have two connections at the top, one coming in and one going out. Then we have the feed through, which is the lug at the bottom of the bus if you have a feed through connection. We can have different blocks depending on when so for the feed through, there's a block for the top of the bus and then a block for the bottom of the bus. So there's actually two lug blocks being used. So if I, first I'm gonna make a change to this panel here, I'm going to change it from standard to, if I change it to actually feed through, it'll put a lug block down there. And if we had a feed through connection, it would make the connection to that block. And then we can make the adjustment to what that block looks like here by choosing a different block. It gives us a couple options where you can go choose something else. I'm trying to remember if I have another good lugs block. And all we have is just that one box drawn up, so we'd have to drop something else. But you could put something else in there. Some people use triangles, I think is the main option I've seen. But if you wanted to have something else in there, you could put that in. And all of those options are where you would make the changes to those blocks. For the wire breaks, we have the option for what that block looks like. So if you have feeders that cross each other, the software puts in the break automatically. Go ahead and pull this panel over here. The breaks only go in when you do the update. So if you have lines that cross, they won't break automatically until you run the update. And this happens to be crossing right where this one actually has a little piece there, so it's getting a little confused. If we pull it up here and run the update one more time, there we go. So there's that break. So right now the break block is just a gap. There's nothing there, but that's the block that we're using. We could change that, and I think we have another block available that we can choose. Yeah, we have the break loop block that comes with the software that you can choose. You can obviously make your own by customizing your block definitions. But the loop will put in a block that looks like that. So depending on how you want your breaks, that's just a different style for how you notate your breaks. And then the final options here are all related to feeder IDs. The first is the feeder ID format. And so this is the format used when it's automatically generating the feeder IDs for you. Everything here we've been seeing is the short, where it's a feeder ID format we've created that is intended to be as short and compact as possible. If we change to long, you will get a longer feeder ID. It has a little bit more information encoded in it, but it's going to take up more space. Since these feeder IDs exist, it's not going to overwrite them in this project. So when you make that change, you actually have to go to your feeder IDs, delete them all, and then when we run the update, it's going to recreate them for us. So it went from those shorts, just 200, to a 200/3 to say that this is a 3-phase wire, and then an N saying it has a neutral, and a G saying it has a ground. And obviously, we're kind of overrunning our little block, so you'd need a wider block at that point to fit all of that in. But that's the long option. We have two more choices. We can do a size plus a letter, and this is just where you have the feeder size and ampacity size as a number, and then there's an A through J for all the different combinations of neutrals and phase wires, so that it's consistently labeling them that way. So we can make that change if we want to. So I'll have to erase all my feeder IDs again. Run the update, it will recreate them all for us. And all of these happen to be very similar, so they all get the .j, but there's different options there depending on the different types of connections being made. And finally, we can do sequential. And this makes the most sense if you actually have the feeder schedule inserted or you have it visible. I'm going to pull the whole thing down here. And we will erase our feeder IDs again. And we run the update. And I'm going to actually update my feeder schedule here also to insert the feeder IDs so it's a little more clear what's being labeled. So this is just 1 through whatever in order. So those are your feeder ID options that we have for the default creation of those feeder IDs. and then we'll label them over here. And then we have a couple options related to the creation, whether we automatically create them or not. So if this was set to yes, it got set to no, I think, because we changed to the sequential, and then everything kind of gets grayed out. But if it's set to yes, they just create them. If it's set to no, it'll actually prompt you for each one to make sure you like the name. The option to copy it to the master schedule when it's created. So if you want to have consistent feeder IDs across all your projects, as you create them in the project, you can copy them to the master for other projects. And then the other half of that, if you need a feeder ID and it doesn't exist in this project, if you want to copy it down from the master schedule automatically or not. So if I set this to no, it'll start prompting me for the feeder IDs. So I'll erase all my feeder IDs to see that happen again. And when we run the update, it'll say, hey, this feeder ID doesn't exist. What do you want it to be? It'll give me the default based upon the format I've chosen, but I have the option to change it. And then it actually has toggles for a couple of those choices, whether I want to create them in the future, like stop bothering me, just create them, go ahead, leave me alone. And then, yes, I also want to copy these to the master schedule, so you can toggle that option on or off in this dialog as well. So otherwise, it'll prompt you for each one, and it can be a little tedious when you first update your one-line diagram, but we'll eventually finish them. And that is it for options in the one-line diagram. In the options command, there's obviously other customization available through layers, through block creation, things like that. We're not going to look at those. We were just looking at the options today. If you go to our weekly training on our website, support and weekly training, we do have continuing education available for these. If you'd like me to send you a nice certificate that you can put in your continuing education binder if you want that for your licensing. So there's an option there to purchase that to handle our bookkeeping and paperwork on our end. We can get that for you. Schedule for future training is listed on the website. Next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at the new features and the new release. So if you're interested in seeing what we've actually done, that's what we'll be talking about the next 2 weeks. Revit-related stuff next week, AutoCAD stuff in 2 weeks. Eventually, as we get these posted, the recordings will be showing up here. We're a little bit behind from last year, so we're hoping to stay on top of that. We actually made a new hire over the summer of a technical writer, so he's working on the documentation for us, and he's also going to stay on top of the training recordings because we just were swamped with work, and that fell by the wayside. So we've got an additional hand to help out with that. Well, thank you for watching today's Design Master training. Contact us with questions or comments by calling 866-516-9497 or emailing support@designmaster.biz.